I would like you to join with me for a moment in time of stillness. It seems important to me that we work toward the goal where prayer and meditation become totally wordless. We need to realize that the words of prayer and affirmation or treatment basically directed toward bringing us in consciousness to the point where we can feel oneness. We need to work more and more toward that experience of a non-verbal awareness, where we just relax and get still and know that the activity of the infinite is already at work in us, already the urge to express through us is ceaselessly a divine flow that is poured out upon us. And our need is to be still and to be relaxed and receptive and just let it happen. So for just a moment, without any words, without any statements, any prayer realizations, just visualize yourself at the center of a dynamic activity that is rushing and pouring and streaming into you from all sides. And you just be still and let. And we give thanks for this. Amen. All right, let's think a little bit about the law of compensation. This law of compensation is certainly one of the important fundamentals of truth. It crops up in many ways, in many variations. I think that most of us have been conditioned to some of the insights of the old theology, as I like to call it, where God is capricious and changeable, and in this relationship sometimes good people suffer and have to be hopefully rewarded in some future heaven, and bad people go unpunished, or so it seems, and their reward will come in some future day of judgment, probably in a roaring, roasting hell of eternal fire. And I'm sure that we've all had exposure to some of that old theology. Now, we like to stress the insight that Jesus so obviously taught, a God of love and a universe of law. It seems to me that Jesus made it completely clear that there is an infallible law of compensation and that this law cannot be broken. Certainly Jesus didn't teach that salvation is free. He told the rich young man that it would require of him everything that he had. Go and sell all you have and give to the poor, he said to the man. Now, this was making no judgment against wealth or saying that the rich man cannot get into heaven and so forth. What he was really suggesting is that there is a commitment that is involved, and one must be willing to let go of all in order to get on the path of the spiritual unfoldment, which is the great goal of life. Fundamental in this is the principle, give, and it shall be given unto you. This is Jesus' statement of the law. Now, under the law of compensation, as it can apply in many ways in our life, there's no such thing as getting something for nothing. And we deal with this often, but I think it's a very important thing because the human consciousness is diluted with all sorts of other things. We have the feeling that we can get a lot for nothing. You can have a lucky break, and you can know the right people, and there are all sorts of things you can do to get something for nothing. But the law of compensation, this fundamental spiritual law, is that we must give full measure for all that we receive in some way at some time. Every day, then, is a day of judgment in which the balance between giving and receiving is struck, and it is always carefully balanced. You may recall the story of the lay preacher in a country area going to preach a Sunday sermon at a neighborhood parish by invitation. He took his little son with him, and they walked through the woods and across the valley to this sweet little church with the steeple. And when he entered the church, he saw there was conspicuously placed in the narthex a contribution box. And so by his good instincts, he reached in his pocket and pulled out $50 and dropped it in the box. So he went in, and they proceeded and had the service. He gave his sermon, and when it was all over with and the crowd had all disappeared, the host minister of this little church came to him and put his arm around him, and he said, "I'm sure grateful you could be here today." He said, "Of course, you know we're not a very prosperous parish, and all we can pay is what is in the box." So they opened the box, and he ceremoniously pulled out its total contents, which was 50 cents. And the man was somewhat chagrined, but he kept his peace and didn't say much. And there, he's walking along home with his son, and he's very quiet. And finally the son said, "You know, Dad, if you'd put more in, you'd have gotten more out." And of course, this is very fundamental in life. It's a universal principle that is operative constantly in every way, in every walk of life, from saint and sinner alike, rich and poor, young and old, Easterner and Westerner. It's a law that never fails. Sometimes we don't like to look at the law. We like to hope that other things will be true. But until one understands this basic truth, he will follow the human reasoning that some people get all the breaks, or why should this happen to me, and so forth. Jesus says this in different ways. He says, "Give, and it shall be given unto you." He says, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." He says, "With what measure ye mete, it shall be measured unto you." In other words, it's pretty clear that he is insisting that the universe is one of absolute integrity. So it is that man always receives what he earns, even if he doesn't seem to. Man cannot receive less than he has earned, neither can he receive more than he's earned. Otherwise, there would be an infraction of the law of perfect balance in the universe. Now, if what we receive seems to be more or less than what is earned, it is only an appearance, it only seems to be so, and there is a readjusting process that is already at work according to divine law to bring about that balance. Now, the unawakened person, we realize, may well feel sorry for himself sometimes and think that he's not receiving his just dues. He's not getting all that he works for, all that he's not doing all that he feels that he should. And he may cry out that something has been kept from him, that another person has taken his place, or that something has been lost or strayed or stolen. But actually, there is no basis in truth for this, and it's so fundamental that one gets it into his consciousness. Now, this is true on various levels. And one of the most obvious, and I think the most important, is the fact that as we think and speak and act toward others, there will be a tendency for others to think and speak and act in the same way toward us. Now, this is fundamental of the law of compensation. And we always then set the tone. We always set the level of consciousness on which there is a relationship. The standard of our tomorrows is set always by the way we deal in consciousness with today. This is fundamental. Now, perhaps this sounds a little bit like the Eastern concept of karma. And I would like us to think a little about this because I think there's a great deal of confusion. I have discussed it before, but I think it bears repetition. Karma is a Sanskrit word that literally means come back. And the best way to think of it is not just the swing of a pendulum, which I think is interesting, but maybe the bouncing of a ball from a wall. If you throw a ball at a wall, there are many factors involved in the bouncing of the ball. The velocity at which you threw it, the direction from which you threw it, the actual composition of the ball itself. A lot of factors go together, but all of them determine that there will be a comeback in a particular way, according to the angle in which it's thrown and the velocity and so forth. the comeback is absolutely certain. There's no question about it. It is a physical law involved. So karma is a law that determines that there is always an effect for every cause. Now, karma, of course, has a lot of other implications, and I think sometimes we subtly buy the idea of karma, along with a lot of other quite beautiful teachings and insights of Eastern religions, without realizing that we have bought something that has a lot of negative implications that we're not aware of. In other words, there is a great difference between karma, as it is set forth by the Hindu religion, and it has various differences in the Eastern teaching, and obviously we can't generalize because there is many variations of Eastern religion, probably twice or three times as many as there are variations within Christianity in America. But so often a person will tend to accept the idea of karma along with some beautiful insight of an Eastern teaching and buy the whole thing, the whole ball of wax, hook, line, and sinker, little realizing that he's bought something that has many negatives that he's not aware of. Now, in karma, for instance, a person is what he is in respect to his fortune, his place in life, because of his karma. Karma fixes consequences of his acts. All mistakes, all failures, all sins must be atoned for in some way at some time. And they become a karmic debt that must ultimately, from lifetime to lifetime, be paid. And of course, along with karma is the Eastern concept of reincarnation. They go hand in hand. Now, under karma, the Easterner explains everything in his world. Suffering, blessing, sorrow, joy, low caste, high caste, pauper and prince, the sick and the healthy. All explained by karma. Nothing one ever does is ever lost. Nothing is unaccounted for. Nothing is forgotten. Nothing is irrelevant. Now, on the surface, it would appear thus far that this is pretty much the same as the idea of Jesus' concept of the law of compensation. But there is a vast and irreconcilable difference. And I think it's important that we see this. In other words, the Hindu concept deals chiefly with man's past and his ultimate destiny. There's little or no hope or promise of freedom today. The cycle of penalty and retribution that continues from lifetime to lifetime goes on and on and on like a wheel that moves relentlessly on, and the person is chained to this wheel by the accumulation of sins of past lives. So common in the Hindu awareness is a sense of hopelessness and resignation. In this concept, there is no healing, there's no overcoming, there's no way out. Now again, this is a generalization, and there are variations on this in the Eastern teachings. But all too often, this is fundamental to the karmic idea. And the goal is simply to develop patience and non-resistance and to accept your karmic debt and to walk on. Now, the great difference between this and the concept Jesus sets forth in the law of compensation is that man is not trying to reach something in God, but to unfold something within himself. In other words, he may, and he often does, inhibit the good that is within him, but he can always know the truth, and the truth shall make him free. At any time along the way, regardless of the weight of limitation that is coming back as a result of causation, the law of cause and effect, at any time he can lift up his consciousness and find forgiveness and freedom from this seeming debt and be healed and be free. Now, this is the basic difference, and it's a very important difference. In other words, karma, which is cause and effect, is the law for matter and mind only, but not for spirit. There is no law of retribution in God. And that's a very important point. We read in the Old Testament, "Yea, I have loved you with an everlasting love." God holds no burden of sin on man. He doesn't lay any sense of limitation on man. God knows nothing of sin. Now, it's true that we always receive the comeback as long as we give out and as we give out. But when we change the way in which we are giving out, when we change the kind of causes that we set up, we immediately change the receiving or the effects. So it's my feeling, and I feel very strongly about this, and it's purely a personal feeling, that we have so many words that give us trouble in our religious and metaphysical vocabulary. We have enough of them of a Western orientation that we kind of have to deal with, that have so many almost fixed attitudes that contain an awful lot that is negative, that I say, why borrow another one that can give us problems? So as far as I'm concerned, the best thing is to eliminate the word karma from your vocabulary entirely. So often persons say, well, this is my karma, and according to karmic debt and so forth. Possibly in their own thought, thinking of it much in terms of the law of compensation, much as Jesus would set it forth, that you can know the truth and be free, but almost unconsciously that word carries with it a whole bondage of limitation that sometimes almost unwittingly and unconsciously we accept and subscribe to. I say we have enough words in our own religious language that give us trouble. One of them is God. The word God itself, unfortunately, has all sorts of built-in limitations, because most of us have been conditioned that the idea of God refers to a man up in the sky somewhere, and when we pray we reach out and reach up and we beg and supplicate, and God gives and God takes away, and God creates and God destroys, and many times simply because of the preconditioning of our earlier years, every time we use the term God, this all comes into consciousness, or at least we have to deal with it. And I say we have enough of that in our Western religious experience, especially when we're trying to deal with it from a metaphysical point of view, than to borrow a lot of Eastern terms that are going to give us a lot more trouble. So again, it's only a personal suggestion, but I think the best thing is to forget about the word karma. Just eliminate it from your vocabulary. Of course, a person does pretty much what he wants to do anyway, so it's purely my own point of view. Now, Western religion has put a great deal of emphasis on the idea of sin and of the law of compensation as the way in which God's punishment is brought about. But I think this has been a misunderstanding. I believe that Jesus taught that you are not punished for your sins as much as you are punished by your sins. Sin is its own punishment, and righteousness is its own reward. Sin basically is a separation in consciousness, and the punishment is simply the punishment of being cut off from the source. In other words, you have a relationship with electricity, and you have light, or you have heat, in terms of this electrical energy being converted into one way or another. And if you have a break in the wire, then the punishment is you lose light or you lose the heat. The reward of righteousness is the light or the heat. So you make the connection or you break the connection. But there's no point in assuming that if you make a break in the connection, that there's something in electricity that is holding you in bondage. That electricity is causing the darkness in your room. So in other words, we really need to work constantly to revise and revamp and reshape our attitude of our relationship to God. To change the concept of the man of the skies who loves and hates and who rewards and punishes and who gives and takes away. And one of the best ways, I think, though one can certainly oversimplify sometimes, but to deal with something that functions according to principle, think of God as light, or as electrical energy that is converted into light as the contact is made, and realize that any break in the circuit shuts off the light. It's that simple. And the break is the sin, and the punishment is the darkness. And again, electricity didn't create the darkness. Not even aware of the darkness. That's the important thing. We punish ourselves by our separation, and when we turn on the light again, the reward of that reuniting of the connection or the righteous experience is light. In Habakkuk in the Old Testament it says, the eyes of God are too pure to behold iniquity. In other words, shocking as it may seem, God knows nothing of sin, God knows nothing of want, God knows nothing of sickness, God knows nothing of injustice. Now this is startling to some persons and very disturbing to some. But I say, why should it be disturbing? The tragedy would be if God did know sin, that if God did know sickness. Because if God knew sin, then God would be a sinner. That's the fundamental metaphysical principle which we deal with so often. What mind knows, mind must be. If infinite mind knows sin, infinite mind must be full of sin. And of course we don't say that at all. The eyes of God are too pure to behold iniquity. Now, of course, then, if God does not know sin, then God cannot forgive sin. Of course, we're trapped into a conclusion that at first seems rather difficult. But you see, the point is, forgiveness does not come from God. This is sometimes hard for a person to grasp, but once he gets the idea, it becomes so clear and so beautiful and so practical and so meaningful and so helpful. So often people go through years of their life begging God for forgiveness, praying for forgiveness, saying over and over again, oh, I just wish God would forgive me. There's no way that God can forgive you because God doesn't hold you in bondage. God knows no offense. Therefore, God doesn't judge. Man knows offense and man judges. The judgment is in human consciousness. That's why Jesus says, judge not, that ye be not judged. He says, for if you forgive men their trespasses, your Father will forgive you. But this is a figure of speech. In other words, it's saying God forgives as we forgive. And the best way to understand that is electricity lights the room as we repair the break. Electricity was not aware of the break, knew nothing of the darkness in the room, but electricity lights the room as we repair the break. It just does its thing, and we allow it to do its thing. We let God be God in us, as Meister Eckhart says. Now, I think the most relevant aspect of the law of compensation is in the general area of giving. And giving, of course, covers a multitude of experiences. We need to work so hard to get into the giving consciousness. This really is what creative life is all about. To get into the consciousness of give, give, give. Think of self as a channel for the expression of God capacities. And don't worry about the comeback. Think give. Jesus puts it in this way. He says, let not your left hand know what your right hand does. Let not your left hand know what your right hand does. In other words, don't get involved in thinking about what or how you're going to receive while you're working or giving. Now, this idea of the left hand and the right hand, I think, is very apt if you think about it a little bit. It's a symbolic thing. But while you're giving, let's say you're using your right hand to work or to actually give or to give someone a pat on the back or whatever it is, you are giving with your right hand. This is the hand by which you are expressing and serving. The left hand is symbolic of the comeback, of the prosperity, of the paycheck, of the reward, of the recognition, of the glory and the honor and so forth. In the one case you give and in the other you receive. But Jesus says don't get the two mixed up. This is a problem that I think many of us have. We may be concerned while we give whether we're being recognized, whether our giving is justified in the sense that maybe I'm giving too much, maybe they're expecting too much of me and they're paying too little, or I'm getting too little praise and reward and so forth. So we get all confused. Henry Ford once talked to one of his young executives that he assumed had something that was holding him back. And he asked this young man, what do you want more than anything else out of life? The man thought for a minute, and then without too much hesitation, he said, money. Henry Ford says, surely you want something else out of life. Well, everything else that I can think of I want takes money, and I want money. That's all I want. I want money, and I'm sure that with money I can do anything. So Henry Ford said, I'm going to talk to you tomorrow. So he came back the next day, and he had a special pair of glasses that he had made up, and he had the lens taken out and put $2 silver in. He said, I'd like you to put these glasses on. So the man put on the glasses, and he said, what do you see? And he said, I can't see a thing. Yes, you can. Well, I see these dollars. Henry Ford said, I want you to think about that for a while, and then we'll talk. Later he came back, and the man said, I think I understand what you mean. In other words, as long as his goal was money, his whole perspective in life was distorted. You see, he was thinking only in terms of the comeback, only in terms of the materiality. Think give instead of get. Now, this is a very difficult awareness to come to for some people because life has been oriented on the idea of reaching the pinnacle, getting success, making more money, and so forth. We think so much of the rewards. As I say so often, success is not getting there. Success is earning the right to be there. In other words, success is a matter of actually applying oneself in give to the extent that the reward comes almost as if, how did that ever happen? The person has never really thought about it because he's been so busy giving. And that's true success. Now, the law of compensation, of course, works in many subtle ways. For instance, if a person is criticized or misjudged or unappreciated, this is a return of what somehow in consciousness we've been projecting. And how important it is to realize that when there's this kind of a difficulty or complication in our life, the old adage is, when things get tight, something's got to give. The only way you can ever get even with any person or any situation is to change the level at which you're dealing with it, to change what you're giving out. In other words, we need to work to get into an appreciative consciousness, which is an attitude of looking for the good or giving forth good thoughts and feelings in every kind of situation, projecting the consciousness of good. When you express appreciation, actually, you appreciate your whole experience in life. You lift things to a higher level, and things begin to happen in a very miraculous way. Little things that once caused you irritation don't irritate you anymore. The attitude of people toward you tends to change. Everything seems to change simply because you are giving a new kind of consciousness in your relationship. And of course, one of the greatest forms of appreciation in this attitude of giving is the idea of praise. Whenever you make contact with a person or an experience in the consciousness of praise, that relationship becomes elevating rather than depressing. When you praise the person and you have an attitude of praise, you tend to raise your whole relationship, you raise your consciousness, and you raise him too. In other words, whatever you do, whenever you're dealing with people, it's so important to think in terms of the flow of love and of praise of that person rather than thinking in terms of what that person can do for you. I always remember a story that was told about himself by Francis J. Gable, who was the editor of the Good Business magazine for many years, actually was the founder of the magazine, and who was a very successful salesman for years before he went out to Unity. And on one of his sales trips, he tells of an experience he had when he was going through a railroad station back in the days when everybody traveled by train. So he was hurrying through the station to catch his train, and he practically ran into and finally sidestepped a crippled man sitting on the floor with his hat full of pencils. And so he stopped and kind of apologized for stumbling over him, and following his good instincts, he reached in his pocket and pulled a coin and dropped it in the hat, and on he went. And after he had traveled a little ways, probably 10 or 15 steps, he suddenly stopped short. And he realized that he had to do something. So he turned around and went to the man, knelt down before him and said, "I want to apologize to you." He said, "I treated you like a beggar, but you're really a merchant." So he stooped down and took one of his pencils and went on his way. A simple act. But that was an evidence of the praising consciousness, you see. It was an evidence of an attitude of constantly thinking in terms of trying to lift the other person. Now, the sequel to the story, I think, is very interesting because it shows that so often inadvertently, just by relating to people in the consciousness of praise, we may be doing something very powerful and very potent for the other person. About a year later, he says he was walking through the same station, and he heard a voice call out, "Hey, mister." And he looked, and here was his crippled friend, this time sitting on a high stool before a newsstand. So he went over and talked to the man, and he said, "You probably don't even remember me," but he said, "I'll never forget you." He said, "In a few moments of things that you said to me, you changed my whole life because you helped me to realize that I was not simply a beggar, that actually I could do something." And he said, "The first thing you know, I found myself asking, what can I do?" So I asked the man nearby if there was any possibility that I could run a newsstand. And the first thing you know, he gave me the opportunity, and he says, "It's been working so well now I have a chance of buying into the stand." And he says, "It all seemed to begin from that moment when you dealt with me as a person." A simple little act, you see, just dealing with someone in a consciousness of praise. So often this happens, and it happens inadvertently, but what a wonderful thing it is to lift one's consciousness so that you deal with people in the attitude of praise. And this is a very important aspect of the law of compensation, because as you deal with life through an attitude of praise, then you tend to set up a whole series of comeback activities that bring this sort of relationship back to you from people and from situations. A person is poor indeed who thinks that he has nothing to give. Of course, in the law of compensation, there is no evading it. There is the actual giving, the actual giving of our material wealth, our material means. And, of course, sometimes I joke about this, but I always feel a little bit that in stressing this aspect of the law, which is a very vital aspect, there's always a feeling, well, people think, oh, here comes the commercial. Because often at this time the minister begins to outline the fact that he has a new roof to put on the church or something or other, so please give. And it's so important to you and to your future salvation that you give. But I believe there's so much more involved in this, so much more involved. I think this whole general idea and attitude of the giving of things and of the giving of money has been set forth for the wrong reasons. Paul gave a simple and effective plan to the Corinthians. And it says, upon the first day of the week, let each one of you lay by him in store as he may prosper. And each member was asked to contribute to what became the Lord's storehouse. And thus each person became a steward of the Lord's goods and entered upon a training program to learn the discipline needed to become a good steward. And this is good, and I think it's very lovely, but I feel that something is lacking. Because, first of all, giving, as I see it, should not be done out of a sense of obligation. And I don't think that one has actually fulfilled in his own consciousness the commitment to the law of compensation if he gives because he thinks that's what he should do. Until he gives because what he wants to do, until he feels this free, spontaneous flow of the Spirit within him, then actually he's limiting himself. For instance, here at the Unity Center, there's no question about it. We have responsibilities, we have rent to pay, and there's a great deal involved in carrying out a work such as this. But we work under the idea, and it's something that I feel very strongly about and have worked with for many years, the idea that in a very real sense, even if it sounds rather naive, that God is the source of our supply. And I believe that, and I believe it with all my heart. And I feel that in functioning in the consciousness of faith and believing that there are many, many channels through which the supply will come, we simply move from month to month. And I've always felt that if I have to get to the place where I have to start haranguing people for money, then perhaps I should go out of business. Maybe this is an evidence that the principle doesn't work. But it does work. I believe it works. So that never in any of the activities that we do here should there be, even if it seems to be, should there be the implication that the giving that is suggested in any of our activities here is for the center. The giving is for you. It's for your fulfilling experience of opening the way of the flow of good in yourself. Giving is an individual experience, and it's so vitally important. Often, I think many persons take courses of study to create or develop a prosperity consciousness. And there are many courses of that type available, and certainly it's very helpful. But there's one thing I think we need to realize. No course of study, no teaching, no technique in metaphysics or in mind control or anything else can make you prosperous unless and until you learn to give, because giving is what it's all about. And sometimes we may be deluded that by using a lot of interesting techniques and devices and pat formulas and so forth, that we're going to create a great deal of prosperity in our life, and it's going to be a great flow of beautiful, wonderful substance. And then often there is that thought in the back of our consciousness, well, when I demonstrate great supply, then I'm going to do such wonderful things with my money, then I'll give to this and I'll do that and so forth. And that's all self-delusion. There's no way that you can begin to demonstrate supply unless you get into an awareness of the law of compensation, the law of giving. Give, and you shall receive. Now, there's another aspect of this that I would like to mention just in passing, because I think there's a great deal of confusion about it, and that's the idea of tithing. Now, I've referred to this before, but I want to be repetitious and refer to it again, because tithing is often stressed as the divine law of giving. But I feel, and I feel very strongly about this, that tithing is not necessarily a law of God. And I believe the whole teaching of tithing in so many of our metaphysical teachings as well as in our Protestant teachings, I think it's set forth for the wrong reasons. I think it's greatly confused. In other words, it has normally been suggested that tithing is a law that God set down and that man must thereby tithe in order to be in tune with God. Now, actually, Now, I've made a careful study of this for a long period of time. In the days of the Israelites, tithing and the usual statements and quotations of the Bible relative to tithing are taken out of the context of the whole general culture in which it was set forth. In the days of the Israelites, tithing was a form of taxation, and there was nothing voluntary about it. As a matter of fact, according to some of the codes set down in those early days, infractions of the rule of tithing was often punishable by death. Now, tithing then, as I say, is set forth for the wrong reasons. It's a vital practice and a very helpful practice. It's an excellent form of systematic giving. It's a tremendous discipline. But I think it's mistakenly used if it is done mechanistically or with the expectation of automatic results or with the delusion that by doing this I'm fulfilling God's law. God's law is not tithing. God's law is giving. Give and receive. And the interesting part of that is I would challenge anyone who has practiced tithing and who's been involved in the law of tithing for a long period of time to give me any kind of support or quotation from the teachings of Jesus relative to tithing. As a matter of fact, you've never heard Jesus quoted in support of tithing. Jesus makes only 2 references relative to tithing, and in both instances, he refers to it while he is involved in a scathing denunciation of the Pharisees, who tithe mint and cumin and anise and leave the weightier matters of the law undone. Now, this is not to say that Jesus condemned the practice of tithing, but it seems that he saw it as a ritual that was far less important than the weightier matters of consciousness. Now, what Jesus did place great emphasis on, and he placed a great emphasis on it, was the idea of giving. Tithing may very well be a tremendous training process, and it is, and it's helpful, and I agree with it as a training process. I'm not talking about tithing being bad. I'm talking about the way in which tithing is approached being self-limiting. Tithing is an excellent training device, like the training wheels on a bicycle. A wise parent, when the child is learning to ride a 2-wheel bicycle, will put training wheels on so that he can ride without falling flat on his face. But the wise parent will also recognize that in time, the child must learn to ride the bicycle without the training wheels. In other words, he must be carefully alert. Otherwise, he creates a kind of a crutch. You wouldn't want to see a person riding a bicycle all his life with training wheels on them. Now, what I'm saying about this is that the idea of tithing, the practice of tithing, is a very important technique in developing one's consciousness and the discipline of consciousness toward giving. But the goal must be not a lifelong practice of writing the tithe check just routinely and getting it out of the way and saying, well, I did my tithing. But we must work toward the awareness where giving becomes spontaneous and free and unstructured, and then use, if you will, the thing I like to do is use the tithing slide rule in retrospect, where at the end of the year, most everybody has to fill out their income tax, and there's a time when you do a little self-auditing. Then you can look back at your year of giving and total it up and see what the percentage is and see how you've done. Now you can check up on yourself, you see. And to me, it's so very important to work in that direction rather than to simply follow the mechanical device of writing the tithe check and sending it out of the way. Now, I agree, you won't hear very many people from a platform saying this about tithing, because usually religious groups are very happy to have you tithe automatically, you see. But I'm saying this because I believe that is a very important aspect that's overlooked. The tithing process is a very helpful technique in giving, but ultimately, free, spontaneous, unstructured giving must be the goal. Otherwise, a lot of things happen. Some persons tithe and feel and tithe faithfully and devotedly, and certainly there's a great deal of credit due to a person who practiced tithing in this way, because it takes a great deal of courage sometimes. But often the person feels that when he's tithed, he's paid his dues. In other words, he's paid his way. So when he has something come up, such as a little problem in his work, he feels very rightly and righteously that because he's tithed, he has a right to expect that his work will work out, that that people will treat him well, and that he'll be able to progress and make the kind of improvement in his job and so forth that he desires. Whereas actually, what he really may require, what he may need, is to do a little more giving in his work. Giving in terms of being more receptive to instruction and to criticism. Giving in terms of being a little more creative. Giving a little more of himself in his work. In other words, the change may be due in his consciousness relative to his work. But it's so easy for the person who feels, well, I tithe, I'm a tither, I've done my giving, now it's time for my job to give to me. And so he may, almost without realizing it, frustrate the flow of good in his life simply because of an erroneous attitude of this systematic process of giving. As I say again, success is not getting there, but it's earning the right to be there. And in this kind of giving, there is a need for giving way, a need for becoming more receptive, more pliable, willing to learn, willing to grow, willing to create. One of the most common handicaps to effective living is the universal desire to do one's share. Now, mind you, I said one of the great handicaps to effective living, the desire to do one's share. Now, let me explain that. There's a feeling in our relationships that one should pull his own load, carry his share of the weight. We insist on it. We want to do our part. And there are few things that any one of us would resent more than the implication that you're not carrying your weight in your work or in your family or whatever. But you see, in this idea lies the fallacy that I think is responsible for a great deal of mediocre and at times ineffective living. Contributing our part, doing our share, at best, is merely a return to the stream of life of what we've taken out of it. But we've never really changed the balance. Nothing has actually been added. And that's not enough, unless the balance is changed. When we think give, instead of get, and let not the left hand know what the right hand does, then we're not going to be too anxious about whether we're doing too much or whether we're getting enough for what we're doing. We're not going to be all that concerned whether somebody is taking advantage of us. As a matter of fact, we're going to be looking for opportunities to give, and to give freely, and to give out of the spontaneous flow of our own relationship with the divine. Emerson says, "Every man takes care that his neighbor shall not cheat him. But a day comes when he begins to care that he doesn't cheat his neighbor. And then all goes well. He has changed his market cart into a chariot in the sun." So what is needed for a fully effective life is to change the balance. In other words, to put a little more in than we take out, to raise the level of the stream in the work that we do. Someone once said you should challenge God to a race of giving. Or as one little old man said, who was somehow always able to do a lot of things that a lot of people in his financial level of life were never able to do, and they could never understand it. And they would ask him, "How are you able to do all this?" He said, "Well," he says, I like to give." And he said, "I shovel out and God shovels in, but God has a bigger shovel." Now the point is, and the principle is, and it's a vital principle, that it is not to be fair that counts most, but to be more than fair. Now this is a part of the law of compensation, a very important part that I think sometimes is overlooked. It's not just to do our share of work, but to do an extra share. Not to just return the love that is given to us, but to return it with an extra measure. Not just to give back the friendliness and the justice and the kindness and the cooperation and the devotion we receive, but to give it back with dividends. There's a blanket company out in the Midwest that uses the advertising slogan, "It's the part that hangs over that counts." And of course we know that in the wintertime, when you have the blanket covering over you, that if it doesn't hang over the side very much, why a lot of cold air comes in and the blanket is not very practical. It's the part that hangs over that counts. The interesting thing is, if you have a group of people, if all of this group here today was involved in a cooperative venture, and everybody felt that he wanted to pull his share, and You always did just exactly what you were told to do, exactly where your responsibilities were. Everybody did just that much and no more. The end result would be chaos. It's like putting together the pieces of a patchwork quilt. They don't just join together, they overlap, so they can be sewed together. And all work involved has to have an overlap. And the overlap means that every person must do a little more than he's supposed to do. And if you don't do a little more than you're supposed to do, if every person doesn't do a little more than he's supposed to do, you have chaos. And that's the part I think that sometimes is overlooked in the idea of sharing the work, sharing the workload, everybody pulling his own load. Everybody has to do a little more than his own load. But the important part in the law of compensation is it's vitally important to every individual, giving the best that is in him in every situation. And giving certainly is the best possible starting point, no matter what it is that you're trying to do. If you have difficulties, you have challenges or problems, giving is the best place to start. I've told some stories about my mother often because she was a dynamic person who had a great insight in truth and a very practical way of dealing with people, and she was very helpful to people in personal counseling. But one of the things she did that was always very startling to people and yet very helpful to them is when she was through with a counseling session and she gave herself totally and unstintingly with people, always when she was through, no matter what the problem was, and this was back during the early Depression years when people had an awful lot of problems, most of them were money, she would say, now before you leave here, I want you to make a commitment of some way that you're going to give. Start right now. She said, now you can think of this as you want. You can give something for your counseling treatment. You can stop before you leave the center and you can do some sort of voluntary service, or you can think right now of something you have at home that you can give away, something that you're not using, or you can decide you're going to do some sort of community volunteer service. But before you leave this room, I want you to make a commitment of how you're going to give. Because unless you begin to give, you're not going to get the help that you desire. And we kid ourselves on that sometimes. And I think we may miss the idea if we say, well, we're just talking about money. Well, money is a very important part of your life and mine. We're involved in an economy where money as an exchange of values is certainly very important. We can't get along very well without it. But that's not the whole thing. The important thing is in consciousness to give way. If we're all tied up with a problem, the best and most practical way to get the answer started is to begin to think give. Think give. Giving in terms of being a little more receptive, a little more pliable. For instance, you might, a person might come to a counselor and say, I want you to pray, we have a great conflict in our office, and there are 2 points of view, and there's this terrible pressure going between the two, and I'd like you to pray for harmony. Well, quite often, you see, there is a tendency to think, well, I want you to pray, but I want you to pray for harmony so that the other people will give in, so that they'll be a little more pliable, a little more responsible. Whereas actually, if one thinks immediately himself, how can I give? If I can't do anything else, I can give a little love. I can praise and bless every person involved. But in many ways, the important thing is to get oneself out of the way and try to realize not just a point of view, but a point of contact. Try to realize a sense of basic unity. Try to realize, as Emmett Fox used to say, that God is on both sides of the bargaining table, on both sides of every issue. And to get on the side of God, which means not just my own opinion, but on the realization that there must be a right solution for all concerned, in which everybody is going to benefit. Giving, then, is giving way. It's a meek, pliable attitude, an attitude of humility, an attitude of receptivity, an attitude of responsiveness, stepping back, in other words, this kind of giving. And quite often that's the vital key to solving problems of all kinds. But the important thing, again, as my dear little mother used to say, begin to give immediately if you want help in some sort of a problem, no matter what the difficulty is. Decide right now, and you might do it yourself this evening. If you have some conflict or some difficulty or some challenge that you're thinking over in your life, just take a moment now to stop and think, how can I give? How can I open the way through giving? Giving in terms of symbolic giving of substance, giving in terms of a commitment in some new experience of service or some new activity or some new way in which I'm going to put myself into my work or to give a little more love or a little more praise. Think give. And you will begin to open doors that perhaps you were not even aware were there. And this is a very important part of the law of compensation. But the law works, and there's no way to get around it. It's working constantly, and it's working right now. There's a poem that has become very popular, and it's well known, a poem by Ella Wheeler Wilcox. You'll recognize it, I'm sure, but I think it covers the subject in a very simple way. She says, "There are loyal hearts, there are spirits brave, there are souls that are pure and true. Then give to the world the best you have, and the best will come back to you. Give love, and love to your heart will flow. A strength in your utmost need. Have faith, and a score of hearts will show their faith in your word and deed. For life is the mirror of king and slave. 'Tis just what you are and do. Then give to the world the best you have, and the best will come back to you."